Last year, we were privileged to have John Dean here and Jim Robinault, who's on my left. And we also got to know Jim's wife, Joanna Connors, and learned about an incredible project she was involved in collaboration with National Geographic and the Cleveland Clinic. It was a face transplant, which she'll describe this morning. She's an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, several other magazines. We are very grateful to have her here this morning at Assembly to talk about this significant topic, and her husband Jim will be speaking this afternoon at Pfeffer, and I'll mention that as you see a video a little bit later in the Assembly. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Connors.
Okay. Good morning. That choir was unbelievable. I just have to say that. That was so beautiful. I'm here. I have very little time to get through this, so I encourage you to, the link will be sent out to this story. I encourage you to read it if you have further interest. I'm going to be kind of zooming through a lot of this. First, I have a bit of a trigger warning. Two things. One is that this involves an attempted suicide. The second is that some of the photos may make people feel squeamish, so just close your eyes when that comes up. There aren't too many of them. It's surgery and plastic surgery. So this story was in last September's 2018. It was the cover story for National Geographic. It was the longest story they have ever printed. It had, the day it was posted online, there were more than 1 million global unique visitors. Ultimately, 300 million visitors, and still climbing. The top online Nat Geo story ever. And the Instagram story was the magazine's most successful ever. They have an incredible social media department there, in addition to their editors and writers and so on. I have 3 points I want to make this morning. One of them is, today is Veterans Day, and this surgery, there have been 40 so far in the world. In the United States, this surgery is supported by the Department of Defense, which does quite a bit of medical research and supports a lot of what are considered experimental surgeries. And the reason they support face transplants and hand transplants is because body armor has gotten so good that when IEDs go off or whatever, the hands and the face are the most vulnerable, and a lot of veterans come back with severe facial injuries, both from bombs and from fire. So all these surgeries cost between $300,000 and $500,000, and it's all Department of Defense. So Veterans Day is appropriate for this. The second is, this story is about heroes, top to bottom. There is no nemesis. The heroes are the young woman who had the face transplant, her family, her parents quit their jobs and just took care of her after her accident. The doctors were amazing, the nurses. And the third is, sorry, I'm going to go back. Content needs editors and fact checkers. This story, from when I met the family and Katie to publication, was 2.5 years. I spent 4 months writing it, 2 years hanging out with the family, interviewing doctors, reading medical journals. And then there was an intense fact-checking process that I went through with 2 fact checkers, one of whom lived in France, so she was always calling me at midnight. Every quote in the story, they called the people and checked. Every medical fact, they checked with the hospital and the doctors. And if you go away with one message today, it is, content is not free, And there's tons you can read on the internet that has not been fact-checked, and we have to pay subscriptions for these. I mean, please, you're going to be leaders of tomorrow. Make sure that fact-checked information gets out to your communities. All right, quick chronology of the story. This is the Stubblefield family. On the right is Katie Stubblefield. They lived in Oxford, Mississippi. Katie was a senior in high school, was already accepted to Ole Miss, was planning to go there. Both of her parents taught at a small Christian academy, and that's where Katie went. It was so small, she was the only person in her senior class. So she was the valedictorian, obviously. She was a vivacious, risk-taking young woman, straight-A student. This is the kind of girl I would have been so jealous of in high school. Just beautiful, as you can see. But she was a teenager, and as we know with suicide rates, teenagers are very vulnerable these days. She had some things going on in her life that I won't go into, but then the final straw was her boyfriend broke up with her, and she was texting him one day, and she found out that he was seeing her best friend. So she left school and went to her brother's apartment, and unfortunately there was a loaded gun there, and it was a very impulsive decision. She was not depressed, she was not, she had no notes, she hadn't prepared. This was impulse, which is the reason guns need to be locked up and not loaded. If she had had 15 minutes to think about it, she wouldn't have done it. But she did, and she used her brother's hunting rifle and put the barrel here and shot herself. That did not kill her. It just shot off most of her face and her mouth, her nose. It blinded her. Up until face transplants, which started in the US in 2008, this next slide is what she would have had to live with the rest of her life. This is the best plastic surgery could do for somebody with that kind of facial injury. So think of the veterans coming back after serving and then having to live like this. My involvement started, well, the accident, which is what her family calls it because it's hard for them to deal with the suicide attempt, was March 25th, 2014. She was about to graduate. She was taken to Memphis from Oxford, where there's a trauma center. A graft from her skin on her belly did not take, and the doctors went to her family and said, her only chance is the Cleveland Clinic, so you should call them. They immediately at the clinic is where the first face transplant in the US was performed. It's where all the research was done, and she would be their third face transplant. She got there May 2nd, 2014. I met her in March of 2016. They had spent those 2 years first just saving her life and then doing all of these reconstructive surgeries you saw in that photo. I met her the day she went on the transplant list. My job was to establish trust with Katie and her family, and that's what the 2 years of being with them was all about, was listening to them, talking to them, really making them feel comfortable with this tragic story being worldwide. So you see, this happened May 2nd, 2014. It took 3 years. It was May 2nd, 2017 before a donor was identified. And that is because even if you have that you're an organ donor on your driver's license, it does not include hands and faces and so on. That's a special ask. And also, Katie was a young woman. Not many young women die, so having a donor that cut down the amount even more. The surgery, 31 hours. 2 ORs connecting, was May 4th and 5th, 2017, and the photographer and I were there for the whole thing. Up until then, those 3 years, She was in and out of the hospital. Her parents stayed with her all the time. The photographer was with her a lot. She photographed their daily life. Anniversaries came and went. Katie's 21st birthday. A lot of waiting time. And I want to emphasize, I said these were all heroes. Katie was extremely courageous to go through this. This is still really experimental surgery, really experimental. And think about it, she has to take anti-rejection drugs for the rest of her life, and there's a risk that it will be rejected at some point. And then what happens? That your whole face is rejected. They have to do a lot of skin grafting. It's already happened twice, once in France and now once with one of the Boston patients, where they have to wait for a new face, a new donor to replace the transplanted face. And since Katie was 21, that's a lot of life for anti-rejection drugs and worrying about that. Although, unlike most of these patients, she's had no rejection episodes so far. And that's over 2 years, which is very rare. So, the donor was finally found. You can see one of the problems they faced in surgery right away in that the donor's face is a lot bigger than Katie's. That we'll come to that in a minute. But the donor was, the doctors had predicted this with the opioid crisis, was a drug overdose. That's where you get young organ donors in the U.S. today, unfortunately. And this is the night before the surgery. Katie's excited. She swore she wasn't nervous or scared. Everybody else was. Everybody, her parents, everybody. Not the doctors, probably. How am I doing on time? This is an iconic Nat Geo photo. This was an amazing moment, and the face had been taken off the donor. It was on its way to the next OR where Katie was waiting. If you look at that, I just see so much reverence in that photo from those doctors. And in fact, one of the doctors described, the one on the very left, described to me his reverence. I'll just read that paragraph. Frank Papé, looking down at the face he carries, feels a kind of reverence. It's an amazing thing, he thinks, what some people will do for others, to give them a heart or a liver, even a face. He says a silent prayer of thanks and takes the face to its next life. The doctors were thinking about Katie, but to me that warmed my heart that he was thinking about the donor and the donor's family and their courage in saying, yes, you can take this face. So I mentioned that the face was too big. The doctors came out of the OR 3 times to consult with the parents and made them make the decision. Katie's mom said to me later, I just wanted to say to them, you make the decision, I can't make this decision. And the decision was whether to give her the entire face of the donor or to just give her partial, in which case some of her skin would still be showing, scars would be showing, but the doctors were saying it's less for the body to reject. So it's a tough decision when it's your daughter. Do you want her to have a nice face that doesn't have scars, or do you want to have her more prone to rejection? Very tough. In the end, they decided on the whole face. And you can see there, even there, you can see that it's big for Katie's head and her face. This is what she looked like coming out of the OR, exactly like the donor. In fact, I showed this photo to the donor's grandmother, who was the one who gave her permission for this donation, and she said, oh my God, that's my granddaughter. This is Katie's parents and her brother, the one who owned the gun, seeing her for the first time. This photo breaks my heart because you can still see the brother's anguish. He has lived with anguish over this incident for 4 years now. But they're also hopeful, you can see in the photo. This is the donor's grandmother. As I mentioned, this kind of donation takes a special ask. This grandmother, Katie, Adria is the donor's name. Adria's parents were both dead, and this grandmother had to make the decision. Here, her granddaughter was in the hospital. She was told that she had no brain activity. She was already an organ donor on her license, so she was already giving her heart and liver and so on. But the grandmother had a very tough decision to make. One thing donor families wonder about is, will the patient who gets this face look exactly like my family member? Will I run into them? Will this be too hard for me? What's going to happen? Well, one thing is, even as much as Katie looked like the donor right after surgery, the face really moves around and settles, and I'll show you a picture of what Katie looks like in a minute. So that isn't a worry. But, you know, it's just a strange thing to think about giving. It's not an internal organ. And same with hands, even for some people. This is where the grandmother and Katie meet. And the first thing the grandmother says to her is, "You look so beautiful." They became close right away. And there were, the photographer was there, of course I was there. There were a ton of people from Life Bank, the donor organization. Everybody had tears in their eyes at this meeting. And they still get together every now and then. The grandmother lives pretty far away, so it's not a regular thing. This is pretty much what Katie looks like today. She was blinded, as I said, so she wears sunglasses most of the time. You can see, this is before 2 further surgeries, so she doesn't look like this today. There were 2 further surgeries that really took a lot of the skin and muscle, the extra stuff. Her face is thinner now. She is still having trouble speaking. Most of the mouth was the donor, including the teeth. And she is in intensive speech therapy and has a special dentist making a prosthesis for her. So one thing I wanted to accomplish with this story is, most of the face transplant stories we see in the New York Times or the Washington Post is, you see the before picture and then you see the after picture, and you don't see everything that happened in between. And this story gives you everything that happened in between. And it shows how much courage and fortitude Katie and her parents needed to get through this long process, and it's continuing today. Maggie, the photographer, and I are still following this story. And this is one of those photos that makes me read and subscribe to National Geographic. It looks like a painting to me. And this is the artistry of the National Geographic photographers. They're amazing. Every issue, every month. I don't work for them, I freelance for them, so I'm not selling subscriptions, but they are starting, it's no longer just anthropology that they do, they're doing science and medicine. So those of you interested in that as a career, or just interested in it, they have lots of science and medicine in National Geographic now. So, I leave you with, please remember to encourage your communities to pay for content. This is, you know, National Geographic had me out there for 2 years. And to honor veterans today and the Department of Defense for this kind of groundbreaking experimentation.
I knew that would be a sobering story, but I hope you like me, will think about the transcendency of what was so good about the ultimate answer to this. So thank you very much, Joanna.